In this lesson, we'll learn how to refine complex blocks and text objects in order to be exported into 3D. Now, certain blocks will be just fine as they are. For example, if we look at some of these chairs and tables, they're relatively simple blocks that you can more or less leave exactly how they are. But certain blocks you do want to convert and make them a lot simpler. For example, some tree blocks can be really complex. Now, you don't necessarily just want to delete the entire tree as we've done with some of the objects like the dimensions. You still want to see what the general landscape is doing. So what you want to do in that scenario is that you just want to double click on the block and then click on OK so that you can edit it. And within your edit manager, you can just make a very simple version of that same tree. So for example, here I'm just going to create two circles, and then I'm going to use MA on my keyboard for match properties to give myself the same properties of that block, and I'm just going to delete the complex objects. Then I'm going to close it and I'm going to say save. So then all of the trees on my entire plan will now be simplified to that same extent, and you can go and do the same to other trees. The exact same applies to other objects. For example, your cars, you don't need to have this much detail. If you really need to see where certain cars are lying, if it's not a very obvious case, for instance, here in the garage, you know that the cars are only going to be in this position. But if you have a more complex arrangement, for example, parking or something, and you really do want to map out the cars, then you can just replace that with a simple rectangular shape, so that you know where that car is supposed to be. There's certain blocks that you don't necessarily need as well, like for instance this. You can either simplify it or delete it completely, or just leave the exterior square that shows you what the position is of that stove and that hot plate. So pretty much the same thing applies to everything else. Have a look at how the other furniture is done and all the other blocks that are on your plan. For example, this palm we don't necessarily need because we already have it in plan, so we don't need to see it in elevation. You can, however, note the height, and you can then always refer back to your elevations or sections after you are in your 3D stage. When you're actually modeling, you can start to do that, but most of this will be done by eye, since no one will really care if it's a 6 meter or a 8 meter high palm tree. So with that out the way, the next thing I'd like to touch on is the text. If you take text objects out of AutoCAD and you import them, or at least export them into 3D Max, you will see that they disappear. And this is because Max doesn't read these text objects. So what needs to be done is this text needs to be exploded so that it converts itself into a ordinary polyline. So this is done through the Express tool. So you can select the text, you can click on Express, text, and then explode text, and the result will be that you have now a whole series of independent polylines that can now easily be exported as ordinary objects into 3D Max. Also, find out for yourself if you really need those text objects to be there. Most of the time they are not necessarily at all. And the only thing that you really do want to have is the finished floor heights, since that is quite helpful when you are modeling to very easily see on your plan what the height of certain floors are. So you know that this is 2 meters, this is 2.45, so that does help. But you don't need to know that it's a dining room, since you can see it by the layout of the furniture, or at least you'll be much more familiar with the building by the stage that you're modeling, that you won't need to know what all the labels are. So get rid of as many labels as you can. You can use the extraction method that I showed you in the last lesson. For example, here I'm going to click on the text, extract it, and then just go and delete as much text as you can. You don't need all these arrows, although you can keep them, or you can even refer back to the plans as you're busy modeling, which is something that I like to do. So the rule here is just extract as much as you can, leave as little as possible, and whatever you do leave, make sure that it's simple geometry that can be easily read and doesn't slow down your viewport manipulation in 3D. So that is it for this lesson. The next lesson I'm going to touch on how we can work with the contours. For example, here we can see that the contours are broken in certain areas. So I'm going to give you a couple of options and methods that you can use to easily get a easy to work with contour map into 3D so that you can make an accurate site mesh or a terrain model of this entire property. So that's going to be touched on in the next lesson.